The antique clock shop sat nestled on a quiet corner of the city, its window displays shimmering faintly under the flickering street lamp. At this late hour, its interior should have been silent, but instead, a cacophony of faint ticking sounds filled the air, like whispers from 1,000 tiny voices. In the center of the shop, a single grandfather clock stood taller than the rest, its pendulum swinging with a deliberate, almost menacing rhythm. When the hour struck midnight, the clock let out a chime, a sound both discordant and mournful, that reverberated through the empty streets outside. Detective Miles Corbin stepped out of his car, his shoes splashing into a shallow puddle on the pavement. The drizzle had turned into a steady mist, clinging to his trench coat and hat as he approached the shop's entrance. His face was drawn, his eyes shadowed by sleepless nights and too many unsolved cases. Yet, as tired as he looked, there was a sharpness to his gaze, a determination born of years spent pursuing justice, no matter how elusive it proved to be. Tonight, he told himself, he would get it right. He had to. The bells above the door jingled faintly as Corbin stepped inside. The overwhelming number of clocks, from ornate grandfather pieces to pocket watches hanging on delicate chains, seemed to press in on him from every angle. The ticking was louder now, filling the air with an oppressive rhythm. And then there was the body. Behind the workbench, the shop's owner lay slumped in his chair, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. A single, precise incision ran across his throat, the blood pooling on the floor already dark and congealed. Corbin took a deep breath and crouched near the body, pulling on a pair of gloves. The victim was an older man, his face lined with years of careful, detailed work. His hands, now limp, were rough and calloused, the hands of someone who had spent decades crafting and repairing intricate mechanisms. Corbin's eyes caught on a small object lying near the body, a gear, no larger than a coin, its edges ornate and engraved with a swirling pattern. He picked it up carefully, holding it closer to his flashlight. This wasn't just any gear. It was a message. Straightening up, Corbin scanned the shop. Every clock was set to a different time, creating a chaos that felt deliberate, almost mocking. The windows and doors showed no signs of forced entry, and the rest of the shop appeared undisturbed. Whoever had done this had planned it meticulously, leaving behind almost no trace, except for the gear. Corbin slipped it into an evidence bag, his thoughts racing. He knew this was no ordinary murder. This was the kind of case that would consume him. The sound of footsteps brought Corbin back to the present. Two uniformed officers stood near the door, their faces pale as they surveyed the scene. "What do we know so far?" Corbin asked, his voice a low rumble. One of them, a young officer named Daniels, shifted uncomfortably. "Not much, Detective. No witnesses, no signs of struggle. Just, this place. It gives me the creeps. All these clocks, and yet it feels off. Like the air's too still." Corbin nodded absently, his attention already returning to the victim. He noticed the angle of the cut again, clean, surgical. Whoever had done this knew exactly what they were doing. "Start a full sweep of the shop," Corbin instructed. "Photograph every inch. I want fingerprints, fibers, anything that doesn't belong. And get me the security footage." Daniels nodded and moved to relay the orders. Corbin turned back to the body, his mind already piecing together the beginnings of a theory. This wasn't a simple crime of passion. This was something bigger, something deliberate. And it was up to him to uncover the truth, no matter how deep it went. Back at the precinct, Corbin sat in a dimly lit room, the glow of the security footage playing across his face. He watched the tapes from the hours leading up to the murder, his brow furrowing as he fast-forwarded through the uneventful footage. And then, at precisely 10:13 p.m., something caught his eye. Every clock in the shop stopped at the exact same moment. The sudden stillness was almost unnerving, even on the grainy black and white screen. Corbin rewound the footage and watched again. No one entered or exited the shop during the critical window. It was as if time itself had been manipulated. Leaning back in his chair, Corbin ran a hand through his hair. This was no coincidence. Whoever had orchestrated this had done so with precision and purpose. His next step was clear: investigate the victim's life. The man had been a recluse, with no known family or close associates, except for one: the estranged brother. Corbin's computer screen filled with a file on Jonathan Hale, the younger sibling who owned a rival clock shop across town. The two had been embroiled in a bitter feud for years, their rivalry well known among the local horology community. Corbin grabbed his coat and headed out. If anyone could shed light on the victim's life and death, it was Jonathan Hale. The rival clock shop was a far cry from the pristine, almost museum-like quality of the victims. It was smaller, cluttered with half-finished projects and tools scattered across workbenches. The air smelled faintly of oil and metal. Jonathan Hale looked up as Corbin entered, his expression a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "Detective," he said, his voice rough. "I assume this is about my brother." Corbin nodded, studying the man carefully. He was younger than the victim, with sharper features and a nervous energy that made him fidget with the tools in his hand. "I'm sorry for your loss," Corbin began, his tone neutral. "When was the last time you spoke to your brother?" Jonathan sighed, setting down the wrench he had been twirling. "Years ago. We didn't see eye to eye on much. He was always the golden boy, the perfectionist. It drove me crazy." Corbin noted the bitterness in his voice. "And yet, you both shared a passion for clocks. Did he ever mention anything about a hidden clock?" At this, Jonathan's expression shifted. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, he looked almost afraid. "He was obsessed with it," Jonathan admitted. "Said it was the key to something bigger. I thought it was nonsense, a fantasy he made up to justify his obsession with old maps and manuscripts." Corbin leaned forward slightly. "Do you recognize this?" he asked, pulling out the evidence bag containing the ornate gear. Jonathan's face paled. That's from one of our family designs," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's unique. Only someone from our family would know how to craft something like that." Corbin filed the information away, his instincts telling him that Jonathan knew more than he was letting on. But before he could press further, Jonathan shook his head. "I don't know anything else, Detective. My brother was always chasing ghosts. He paid the price for it." Back at the precinct, Corbin delved deeper into the victim's records. The man had spent a fortune on old maps, manuscripts, and rare artifacts, all tied to the legend of the hidden clock. One symbol appeared repeatedly in his notes, a geometric design linked to a secretive group known as the Guardians of Time. Rumors about the society painted them as zealots, obsessed with controlling history through the manipulation of time. Corbin felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a murder. This was a conspiracy. Corbin sat at his desk, the dim light of his lamp casting long shadows across the office. His notes were spread out before him in a chaotic arrangement: photographs of the crime scene, printouts of the security footage, the victim's financial records, and now, a growing file on the Guardians of Time. The deeper he delved into the victim's life, the more the pieces began to connect, yet the picture they formed was still unclear. The Guardians, it seemed, were more than just a fringe group. They were rumored to have ties to influential figures in the city, politicians, business leaders, even law enforcement. And their obsession with time was not just metaphorical. They believed in its control, its mastery, as a way to shape the world to their design. One detail stood out: the clock. The victim's family had crafted it generations ago, and it was said to hold the key to something extraordinary. Corbin didn't yet know what that meant, but he was certain the murder was about more than just a feud between two brothers. Someone had wanted that clock, and they had been willing to kill for it. The ornate gear found at the crime scene, it wasn't just a clue. It was a breadcrumb, deliberately left behind to lead him deeper into the labyrinth. Corbin leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He needed more information. Pulling out his phone, he dialed the precinct's research department. "This is Corbin," he said as soon as the line was picked up. "I need everything you can find on a group called the Guardians of Time. Members, history, anything. And cross-reference it with Jonathan Hale and his brother." The voice on the other end acknowledged the request, and Corbin hung up. His instincts told him he didn't have much time. Whoever was behind this wouldn't sit idle for long. The next morning, Corbin found himself back at the crime scene. The shop was still cordoned off, yellow tape fluttering in the early morning breeze. The ticking of the clocks was quieter now, subdued, as if the shop itself were mourning its owner. Corbin's eyes scanned the room, searching for something he might have missed earlier. He moved with deliberate care, his fingers brushing along dusty shelves and the polished surfaces of the clocks. His attention was drawn to the grandfather clock near the workbench. Its towering frame seemed to dominate the room, its face frozen at 10:13. "Why you?" Corbin muttered under his breath. His gloved hands moved over the clock surface, searching for anything unusual. And then he found it, a faint seam in the wood, almost imperceptible. Carefully, he pressed against it, and the panel slid open with a soft click. Inside was a small, ornate clock. Its design was intricate, almost otherworldly, with delicate engravings that seemed to shimmer in the light. At its center was an empty slot, the perfect size for the gear he had found. Corbin's pulse quickened as he retrieved the gear from his pocket and fitted it into place. The clock began to hum faintly, its hands trembling before locking into position. It was set to 3:17. Corbin stared at the time, a strange unease settling over him. That number, it felt familiar, though he couldn't immediately place it. He pulled out his notebook, flipping through pages of old case notes. And then it hit him. 317 was the address of an abandoned theater where he had investigated a series of grisly murders years ago. The case had gone cold, the perpetrators never caught, but now it seemed to resurface with chilling clarity. The victims from that case, Corbin realized with a sinking feeling, had been connected to the guardians of time. The implications were staggering. The theater wasn't just a coincidence. It was a message, a breadcrumb in the killer's twisted game. Corbin knew he couldn't ignore it. He grabbed his coat and headed for the theater, his mind racing with possibilities. He didn't know what he would find there, but he had no doubt it would bring him closer to the truth. The theater was a relic of a bygone era, its once grand facade now crumbling with age. Ivy crept along its walls, and the marquee above the entrance was missing letters, leaving only a ghost of its former name. Corbin pushed through the rusted doors, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. The faint smell of mildew clung to the velvet seats, most of which were torn or overturned. His footsteps echoed as he made his way down the aisle, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The stage was the centerpiece of the room, its wooden boards warped and splintered with age. But it was what lay atop the stage that made Corbin stop in his tracks. Arranged in a perfect circle were 12 objects, each one a clock, their faces turned outward like the numbers on a clock face. In the center of the circle stood a man, his back to Corbin. He was tall and thin, his silhouette sharp against the dim light filtering through the broken windows. Corbin's hand instinctively moved to his holster. "Detective Corbin," the man said, his voice calm and measured. He turned slowly, and Corbin's breath caught. It was Jonathan Hale. But something about him was different. The nervous energy from their first meeting was gone, replaced by a cold confidence. "I was wondering when you'd arrive." Corbin stepped closer, his flashlight trained on Hale. "You've got a lot of explaining to do," he said, his voice steady. "What is this? What are you trying to accomplish here?" Hale spread his arms, gesturing to the circle of clocks around him. "This," he said, "is history. My brother and I were meant to be its caretakers, its architects. But he was weak. He didn't understand the power we held, the responsibility. He clung to outdated notions of morality and restraint. I, on the other hand, see the truth." "And what truth is that?" Corbin asked, his teeth clenched. "That time is power," Hale replied, his voice almost reverent. "And with this clock, I can control it. The Guardians understood that, but even they were afraid to use it. My brother, he was going to hand it over to them. He didn't see the potential. But I do." Corbin stepped closer, his hand still hovering near his gun. "You killed your brother," he said, his tone accusatory. "All for this. For power." Hale's expression darkened. "Don't reduce this to something so petty, Detective. My brother's death was necessary. A means to an end. And now, I will finish what he could not." Before Corbin could respond, Hale reached into his coat and pulled out a small device. He pressed a button, and the clocks around them began to tick in unison, their hands spinning faster and faster. The hum in the air grew louder, almost deafening. Corbin drew his gun, aiming it squarely at Hale. "Stop this," he demanded. "Now." Hale looked at him, a twisted smile on his face. "You can't stop what's already begun," he said. And with that, he lunged for the small clock in Corbin's hand. Corbin reacted on instinct, sidestepping as Jonathan Hale lunged for the clock. The younger man stumbled but recovered quickly, his face twisted in fury. "You don't understand what you're holding," Hale snarled, circling Corbin like a predator sizing up its prey. "That clock isn't just a key, it's the culmination of generations of knowledge. You think stopping me will end this? You're just another pawn in a game that started long before you were born." Corbin kept his gun trained on Hale, his breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "A pawn, huh?" he said, his voice low. "Funny. I've been called worse. But here's the thing, I don't care about your games or whatever power trip you're on. All I care about is justice for your brother." He tightened his grip on the clock in his other hand. Its weight felt heavier now, as though the object itself carried the burden of the secrets it held. "And justice starts with you." Hale's eyes flicked to the clock and back to Corbin, his expression calculating. "You think you've won just because you're holding it? You're no different than my brother," Hale spat. "Afraid of what it could do. Afraid of what you could do with it." He took a step closer, his hands raised in mock surrender. "But ask yourself, Detective, don't you ever want to change the past? Fix the mistakes you've made? People you couldn't save?" The words hit Corbin harder than he expected, and for a split second, his mind flashed to the faces of those he'd failed over the years. Victims whose killers he never caught. Lives lost because he hadn't been fast enough, smart enough, or strong enough. But he shook the thought away, narrowing his eyes at Hale. "You don't get to manipulate me," he said, his voice sharp. "Whatever this thing is, whatever it can do, it's not meant for people like you." Hale smirked, his confidence returning. "And what makes you think you're any better? Do you even know how to use it? Do you even understand what it is?" He gestured wildly at the circle of clocks around them, their hands spinning faster and faster until the ticking became a single, droning hum. "This isn't just a clock. It's a nexus, a convergence of time and space. With it, you could rewrite everything. Or destroy everything," Corbin countered, his voice rising above the noise. "I've seen enough power-hungry lunatics to know how this ends. You're not rewriting history, Hale. You're repeating it." Before Hale could respond, the humming from the clocks reached a crescendo. The air in the theater seemed to ripple, and Corbin felt a strange pull, as though the ground beneath him were shifting. Hale's face lit up with a mix of triumph and awe. "It's starting," he whispered, more to himself than to Corbin. "This is it." Corbin didn't wait to find out what it was. He fired a warning shot into the air, the sound cutting through the droning hum. "Step away," he barked. But Hale was beyond reason now. He made another desperate grab for the clock, and this time, Corbin was ready. He sidestepped again, spinning to knock Hale off balance. The man fell to the ground with a grunt, but even then, his eyes were locked on the clock, his desperation palpable. The ground beneath them began to tremble, and Corbin realized with growing dread that whatever the clocks were powering was coming to life. The stage beneath the circle of clocks began to glow faintly, a strange, golden light emanating from the cracks between the floorboards. The air grew hotter, heavier, as though the theater itself were holding its breath. Corbin knew he had to act fast. He glanced at the small clock in his hand, its ornate hands still frozen at 3:17. If this was the key, then maybe, just maybe, it could also be the switch to shut everything down. Taking a deep breath, he turned his attention back to Hale, who was struggling to his feet. "Tell me how to stop this," Corbin demanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Or I swear, I'll destroy this thing right here and now." Hale laughed, the sound unhinged. "You think you can stop it? You think breaking it will change anything? The clock isn't just a mechanism, it's an idea. An inevitability. You can't stop time, detective. No one can." Corbin felt a surge of frustration. "Maybe not," he said, his voice grim. "But I can stop you." With that, he swung the butt of his gun, striking Hale across the temple. The man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. The glow from the stage was growing brighter now, almost blinding. Corbin shielded his eyes, his mind racing. He had no choice but to trust his instincts. Holding the small clock tightly, he ran toward the center of the stage. The moment his feet crossed the boundary of the circle, the clocks around him stopped spinning. The silence that followed was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos mere moments ago. Corbin placed the small clock on the ground, his hands trembling slightly. He hesitated for a moment, then turned the gear he had inserted earlier. To his surprise, the clock's hands began to move, ticking forward with a steady rhythm. The glow from the stage dimmed, and the air grew still once more. Whatever the device had been powering, it was shutting down. Corbin exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging with relief. But his victory was short-lived. Behind him, Hale stirred, groaning as he pushed himself to his knees. "You don't understand what you've done," Hale said, his voice weak but laced with fury. "You've just delayed the inevitable. The Guardians will come for you now. You've made yourself their enemy." Corbin turned to face him, his expression hard. "Let them come," he said simply. "But you won't be around to see it." He pulled out a pair of handcuffs and secured Hale's wrists. The man didn't resist, his energy spent. As Corbin led Hale out of the theater, the first rays of dawn began to break through the city's skyline. The streets were quiet, the world oblivious to the events that had just unfolded. But Corbin knew this wasn't the end. The clock, the artifact, was too powerful, too dangerous. It would need to be locked away, hidden where no one could find it. Back at the precinct, Corbin placed the small clock into an evidence locker, its ornate design catching the harsh fluorescent light. He stared at it for a long moment, the weight of its implications pressing heavily on his mind. He knew he couldn't keep it there forever. Someone, somewhere, would come looking for it. And when they did, he needed to be ready. As he closed the locker, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A new case file. A missing person. Corbin sighed, grabbing his coat. There was no rest for someone like him. The city always had another mystery, another dark corner that needed the light. And as long as he was breathing, he'd be there to uncover the truth. He glanced at his watch as he left the precinct. 3:17, the time made him pause, just for a moment. Then, with a faint smirk, he stepped into the morning light, ready to face whatever came next. Corbin drove through the quiet morning streets, the hum of the city just beginning to stir. The clock, now locked away, felt like a ghost lingering in his thoughts, its intricacies and dangers impossible to ignore. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his mind replaying Hale's final words. "The Guardians will come for you now." The missing persons case waiting on his desk might have seemed routine on the surface, but Corbin couldn't shake the feeling that everything in his life was beginning to connect in ways he couldn't yet understand. His gut told him that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Parking his car in front of a rundown diner, he stepped out and pulled his coat tighter against the crisp air. He needed coffee, maybe something stronger, before heading back to the precinct. Inside, the smell of burnt toast and cheap brew greeted him like an old friend. He found a corner booth, out of sight but with a view of the door, a habit he'd picked up after years of living on the edge of danger. As the waitress poured him a cup of coffee, Corbin noticed a man sitting at the counter, his back turned. Something about the man's posture, a deliberate stillness, put Corbin on edge. His instincts kicked in, and he found himself casually reaching for his phone, pretending to scroll while keeping the stranger in his peripheral vision. The man turned slightly, revealing a sharp profile and piercing eyes that seemed to scan the room with a predator's precision. Then, almost imperceptibly, the man's gaze landed on Corbin. For a moment, neither moved. It was a silent acknowledgement, a flicker of mutual understanding. The man stood, leaving a few bills on the counter, and walked out of the diner without a glance back. Corbin's pulse quickened. He threw a few dollars on the table and followed, his hand instinctively brushing against the holster under his coat. Outside, the street was empty. Corbin scanned the area, but the man had disappeared, as if he'd evaporated into the morning mist. Frustrated, Corbin turned back toward his car and froze. A small, folded piece of paper was tucked under his windshield wiper. He approached cautiously, glancing around to ensure he wasn't being watched. Unfolding the note, he found a single sentence scrawled in neat, deliberate handwriting: "Time waits for no man, detective." Corbin's jaw tightened. Whoever had left the note hadn't just been watching him, they knew about the case. About the clock. Folding the paper, he slid it into his pocket and got into the car, his mind racing. This wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. Back at the precinct, Corbin found his desk buried under a fresh pile of case files. He tossed his coat on the back of his chair and picked up the first file, the missing person one that had come through earlier. The details were sparse: a young woman named Emily Carter, last seen 2 nights ago. No sign of struggle, no obvious suspects. Just a name, a photo, and a question mark. Corbin flipped through the pages, looking for anything that might stand out. And then he saw it, her last known location. An address that made his stomach twist. 317 Meridian Avenue. The connection was too blatant to be a coincidence. Corbin leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. The address wasn't far from the theater where he'd confronted Hale, and it wasn't far from the antique shop either. It was as if someone, or something, was drawing him deeper into a web he couldn't see the edges of. He grabbed the file and headed straight for Meridian Avenue, his mind a storm of questions. The street was unremarkable, lined with old brick buildings and the occasional boarded-up storefront. But as Corbin approached the address in the file, he felt a strange sense of déjà vu. The building was a nondescript warehouse, its windows covered with grime and its entrance secured by a rusted metal door. It looked abandoned, but Corbin knew better. Pushing the door open, he stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the faint smell of oil and mildew. Stacks of wooden crates lined the walls, their labels faded and illegible. Corbin moved cautiously, the floor creaking under his weight. At the far end of the room, he spotted something that made his heart skip a beat: a table covered in tools, gears, and blueprints. And sitting in the center of it all was a clock. It wasn't like the one he'd found at the antique shop. This one was larger, more intricate, its design almost organic, as if it were alive. The hands were moving, but not in any way Corbin had ever seen before. They ticked backward, pausing every few seconds before resuming their strange dance. He approached slowly, his flashlight illuminating the strange markings etched into its surface. Symbols, numbers, and letters he couldn't decipher. A noise behind him made him whirl around, his gun drawn. But the room was empty. The shadows seemed to shift, dancing just out of reach of the light. Corbin took a step back toward the clock, his senses on high alert. And then he heard it, a whisper, faint and indistinct, like a voice carried on the wind. "Detective Corbin," the voice said, low and almost melodic. It wasn't coming from any one direction. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. "You've come far, but the journey is just beginning." Corbin tightened his grip on his gun. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice echoing in the empty space. The whisper didn't answer. Instead, the clock began to glow faintly, the symbols on its surface lighting up one by one. The hands spun faster now, their erratic movement creating a strange, rhythmic hum. Corbin felt a chill crawl up his spine. This wasn't just a clock. It was something more, something he didn't yet understand. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the glow faded. The room was silent again. Corbin stood motionless, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what had just happened, but he knew it wasn't over. Whatever game he'd been drawn into, the stakes were higher than he'd imagined. He stepped back from the clock, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But as he turned to go, he noticed something on the table, an envelope, its edges yellowed with age. His name was written on it in the same neat handwriting as the note he'd found on his car. Corbin hesitated, then picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single photograph. It was of Emily Carter, the missing woman. But she wasn't alone. Standing beside her, his arm around her shoulders, was Jonathan Hale. Corbin's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a missing persons case. This was a message. And it was meant for him. Corbin stared at the photograph, his mind reeling. Emily Carter and Jonathan Hale, together, smiling, as if they were old friends. But how? Hale hadn't mentioned her, and there was no indication in the missing persons file that she had any connection to him. Yet here they were, captured in a moment that felt both casual and calculated. The photograph had to have been placed here intentionally, meant to draw him deeper into this ever-twisting puzzle. Sliding the photograph into his coat pocket, Corbin turned back to the strange, glowing clock. Its intricate symbols and backward-spinning hands seemed to pulse faintly, as though it were alive and watching him. He felt a pull, a deeply unsettling sensation, as if the clock were tugging at something inside him. He had the distinct impression that it wasn't just a machine, it was something much older, much more dangerous. Corbin forced himself to look away, his grip tightening around the photograph in his pocket. He needed answers, and he wouldn't find them by standing in this warehouse. The photograph was a lead, a tenuous one, but a lead nonetheless. He had to figure out where it was taken and what connection Emily had to Hale. As he left the building, the faint hum of the clock followed him, lingering in his ears like an echo that refused to fade. Back at the precinct, Corbin spread the photograph on his desk, studying every detail. The background was blurred, but he could make out the faint outline of a clock face mounted on a wall. It wasn't ornate or antique like the ones he'd seen in Hale's shop or the victim's store. It was utilitarian, almost industrial. The setting didn't look like a home or a shop, it looked like a workshop or a factory. Corbin leaned closer, squinting at the faint lettering on the clock. It was too blurry to read, but the style of the numbers felt familiar. He reached for his phone and dialed the research department. "It's Corbin," he said as soon as the line picked up. "I need you to comb through city records for any factories or workshops connected to clocks or timepieces. Focus on older buildings, ones that might have been abandoned or repurposed over the years." The voice on the other end hesitated. "That's a pretty broad search, Detective. Can you narrow it down at all?" Corbin sighed, his patience thinning. "Look for anything near 317 Meridian Avenue. And cross-reference it with the name Jonathan Hale. I don't care if it's a long shot, just find me something." He hung up before they could respond, leaning back in his chair with a frustrated sigh. Every piece of this case felt like it was deliberately designed to taunt him, to keep him just one step behind. He pulled the note from his pocket, the one left on his car, and unfolded it again. "Time waits for no man." The words felt heavier now, as if they carried an edge of inevitability. Hours later, Corbin's phone buzzed. It was the research department. "Detective, we found something. There's an old clock manufacturing plant on the outskirts of the city. It's been abandoned for decades, but it matches your description. The records show it was purchased a few years ago by a private owner, but the name on the deed is redacted. The address is 1717 Ironwood Lane." Corbin grabbed his coat. "Send me the full file," he said, his voice curt. "I'm heading there now." The factory loomed large and foreboding against the evening sky, its brick facade weathered by time and neglect. Corbin parked a block away and approached on foot, his senses heightened. The air was thick with the smell of rust and damp earth, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed in the distance. The building's windows were boarded up, but faint light seeped through the cracks, casting eerie shadows on the ground. Corbin reached the main entrance and tested the door. It creaked open with little resistance, the rusted hinges groaning under the weight of years. Inside, the air was colder, heavier, as if the factory itself were holding its breath. His flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing rows of rusted machinery and conveyor belts long since abandoned. The place was a graveyard of industry, and yet, Corbin couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He moved cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the dust-covered floor. In the distance, he saw a faint glow, soft, golden light emanating from deeper within the factory. He tightened his grip on his flashlight and gun, his pulse quickening as he followed the light. The glow led him to a large, open room at the heart of the factory. At its center was a massive clock, its face cracked and weathered, but still ticking. Surrounding it were tables covered with blueprints, tools, and strange mechanical devices that Corbin couldn't begin to understand. And standing in the shadows, just beyond the reach of his flashlight, was a figure. "Detective Corbin," the voice said, low and smooth. The figure stepped into the light, revealing a tall man with sharp features and piercing eyes. He was dressed in a dark suit, his demeanor calm and composed. "I've been expecting you." Corbin raised his gun. "Who are you? And where's Emily Carter?" The man smiled faintly, as if amused by the question. "Emily is safe, for now. But you've walked into something far greater than you realize, Detective. You've seen the clocks, felt their pull. You must understand by now that this is about more than just a missing woman or a petty rivalry between brothers." Corbin kept his gun trained on the man, his jaw tightening. "I don't have time for cryptic speeches. Start talking, or I start shooting." The man tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanging. "If you shoot me, you'll lose your only chance to save her. And you'll never understand the truth about the Guardians, the clock, or yourself." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Corbin hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger. He hated to admit it, but the man was right. Whatever this was, it was bigger than him. Bigger than Emily. Bigger than anything he'd ever encountered. "Talk," Corbin said finally, lowering his gun slightly but not fully. "And make it quick." The man stepped closer, his sharp features illuminated by the golden glow of the massive clock. "The Guardians of Time are not just a myth, Detective. They are real, and their purpose is simple: to control time, to shape history. The clock you found is one of many. Each one is a key, a gateway to possibilities that most people can't even begin to comprehend." Corbin frowned. "Why Emily? What does she have to do with this?" The man's smile faded. "Emily is special. She's connected to the clocks in ways even she doesn't fully understand. Jonathan Hale knew this, which is why he brought her into his orbit. But he underestimated her importance. As have you." Corbin's grip on his gun tightened again. "Where is she?" The man gestured toward the massive clock. "Through there," he said simply. "But be warned, Detective. Once you step through, there's no going back. Time will no longer be your ally." Corbin stared at the clock, its hands spinning in a slow, deliberate rhythm. He didn't know what lay beyond it, but he knew one thing for certain: Emily was in danger, and he was the only one who could save her. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, the golden light swallowing him whole. The golden light enveloped Corbin, and for a moment, the world seemed to dissolve around him. It wasn't just a sensation of movement, it was as if reality itself fractured and reassembled, each fragment twisting and merging into something new. His breath caught in his throat as the air around him became thick, charged with an energy he couldn't name. The hum of the clock echoed in his ears, growing louder, and then, suddenly, everything went silent. When the light faded, Corbin found himself standing in an entirely different place. The factory was gone. In its place was a vast, open room with no discernible walls or ceiling, only a hazy, endless expanse of golden light. The floor beneath his feet was smooth and reflective, like glass, and the air was unnervingly still. Ahead of him, suspended in the void, was another clock. This one was massive, larger than any he'd ever seen. Its gears turned slowly, and its hands ticked forward with deliberate purpose. And there, standing in the shadow of the giant clock, was Emily Carter. Emily! Corbin's voice echoed in the emptiness as he rushed toward her. She turned at the sound of his voice, her face pale but calm. Her expression was one of recognition, but not relief. It was as though she had expected him all along. "Detective Corbin," she said softly, her voice carrying a strange resonance. "You shouldn't have come here." Corbin stopped a few feet away, his eyes scanning her for any signs of injury. She looked unharmed, but there was something different about her, something in her eyes, as if she were seeing things he couldn't. "Emily, you're coming with me," he said firmly. "We're getting out of here." She shook her head slowly. "I can't leave, and neither can you." "Not yet." Corbin frowned, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "What are you talking about?" "I'm here to help you. Whatever this place is, we'll figure it out, but first, we have to leave." Emily stepped closer to the giant clock, her gaze fixed on its intricate mechanisms. "This isn't just a place, Detective. It's in between. The Guardians call it the Nexus. It's where time converges, where every possibility exists all at once." She turned back to him, her expression unreadable. "And I'm the reason you're here." Corbin felt a chill crawl up his spine. "What do you mean?" Before she could answer, the air around them shifted. The stillness was replaced by a low, rumbling sound, like distant thunder. Corbin's hand instinctively went to his gun as he turned, searching for the source. Out of the golden haze, figures began to emerge, tall, cloaked figures with faces obscured by masks. Their movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as they formed a circle around Corbin and Emily. "The Guardians," Emily said quietly, her voice tinged with both fear and reverence. Corbin raised his gun, his stance defensive. "Stay behind me," he said, his eyes darting between the figures. "If they try anything." "You can't fight them," Emily interrupted, her tone firm. "They're not here to hurt us." "Not yet." One of the cloaked figures stepped forward, its mask a smooth, featureless oval. When it spoke, its voice was deep and resonant, carrying an unnatural weight. "Detective Miles Corbin," it said, the sound reverberating through the space. "You have come far, but you do not belong here." Corbin squared his shoulders, his grip on his gun unwavering. "I'm here for her," he said, nodding toward Emily. "And I'm not leaving without her." The Guardian tilted its head slightly, as if considering his words. "She is not yours to take. She is bound to the Nexus, as you are now." "I don't care about your Nexus," Corbin snapped. "Whatever game you're playing, it ends now." The Guardian's mask seemed to shimmer, the faintest hint of emotion, amusement, perhaps, emanating from it. "You misunderstand, Detective. This is not a game. This is the essence of existence. Time is not a river, as you perceive it. It is a web, and every thread is connected. The clock you hold, the choices you make, they are threads in the web. And now, you are entangled." Corbin's mind raced, trying to process the Guardian's words. "Why her?" he demanded. "Why Emily?" "Because she is the keeper," the Guardian said simply. "The clocks respond to her. They always have. She is their anchor, their guide. And you." The Guardian turned its masked face toward Corbin. "You are the disruptor." Corbin's jaw tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about, but I know this: you've been manipulating her. Using her. That stops now." The Guardian stepped closer, its presence looming. "You think yourself a hero, Detective. A savior. But in your desire to protect, you risk unraveling everything. The thread you pull may undo the entire web." Corbin's grip on his gun faltered for just a moment as the weight of the Guardian's words sank in. He glanced at Emily, who stood silently, her expression a mixture of sorrow and determination. "Emily," he said, his voice softer now. "Tell me what's going on. Tell me how to stop this." She met his gaze, her eyes filled with a strange, otherworldly clarity. "You can't stop it, Corbin. The clocks, the guardians, the nexus, it's all bigger than us. But you can make a choice. A choice that will shape everything." "What choice?" Corbin asked, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "What are you talking about?" Emily stepped closer to him, placing a hand on the clock he still held. "This clock," she said, her voice steady. "It's the key. It can reset the web, repair the threads that have frayed. But doing so comes at a cost." Corbin frowned. "What cost?" Emily hesitated, her expression pained. "If you use it, you'll change everything. The guardians, the clocks, me, will be erased. The web will be restored, but at the expense of everything you've seen here." Corbin stared at her, his mind racing. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, heavier than anything he'd ever faced. If he used the clock, he could end this nightmare, but at the cost of losing Emily and everything she represented. And if he didn't? The guardians began to close in, their presence suffocating. "Choose, detective," the lead guardian said, its voice cold and unyielding. "The web cannot remain as it is." Emily looked at him, her eyes pleading. "You have to decide, Corbin. Time is running out." Corbin tightened his grip on the clock, his heart pounding. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a reckoning. And the choice he made now would echo across every thread of time. Taking a deep breath, he made his decision. Corbin's hands trembled as he cradled the clock, its mechanisms ticking softly, almost as if it were alive and waiting for his decision. His mind raced. The guardians loomed closer, their cloaked forms imposing, their silent presence pressing against his every thought. Emily stood before him, her gaze steadied but filled with a quiet sadness. The weight of the moment hung in the air, suffocating and absolute. "What happens if I don't use it?" Corbin asked, his voice strained. He wasn't sure who he was directing the question to, Emily, the guardians, or even himself. The lead guardian stepped forward, its mask shimmering faintly in the golden light. "If you do not act, the web will collapse," it said. "The threads will unravel, and time itself will fracture. The world as you know it will cease to exist." Corbin clenched his jaw. "And if I do use it?" Emily answered this time, her voice soft but firm. "The web will reset. Everything will be restored to balance. But the nexus, the clocks, and me, will all be gone. It will be as if none of this ever existed." Corbin felt his pulse pounding in his ears. The choice before him seemed impossible. He could save the world, but it would come at the cost of erasing Emily, a woman who had done nothing to deserve this fate. And yet, if he hesitated, if he faltered, the consequences would be catastrophic. The guardians stood silently, waiting, their masked faces unreadable. Corbin felt the pressure mounting, the weight of time itself bearing down on him. He looked at Emily, searching for anything, any sign, any glimmer of hope. "Why me?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. "Why am I the one who has to decide this?" Emily stepped closer, her expression softening. "Because you're the disruptor, Corbin," she said. "You're the one who saw through the fractures in the web. You're the one who followed the threads, even when it didn't make sense. That's why the guardians fear you. You're the only one who can see the choice for what it really is." Corbin's throat tightened. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to demand that someone else shoulder this impossible burden. But deep down, he knew there was no one else. It had to be him. He glanced at the clock in his hands, its intricate gears turning in perfect synchrony. The symbols on its surface seemed to glow faintly, almost as if they were alive and aware of his struggle. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. "I'm sorry, Emily," he said quietly. "I have to do this." Emily's face softened, and for the first time, a tear rolled down her cheek. "I know," she whispered. I knew you would. Corbin turned the clock in his hands, his fingers finding the small gear he had inserted earlier. With a steady hand, he began to turn it. The clock's ticking grew louder, its glow intensifying. The air around them shifted, the golden light growing brighter and brighter until it was blinding. The Guardians stepped back, their forms dissolving into the light. Emily stood still, her eyes locked on Corbin's. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the clock. And then, she was gone. When Corbin opened his eyes, he was standing on a quiet street. The factory, the Nexus, the Guardians, everything was gone. The golden light had vanished, replaced by the soft, gray haze of dawn. He glanced around, disoriented, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. His hands were empty. The clock was gone. The street was familiar, Meridian Avenue. But it wasn't the same as before. The buildings were intact, their windows cleaned and unbroken. The air felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from the world. Corbin reached into his coat pocket, searching for the photograph of Emily and Hale. His fingers brushed against the envelope, and for a moment, he felt a flicker of hope. But when he pulled it out, the photograph was blank. The faces, the background, everything was gone, erased as if it had never existed. He felt a pang of loss, sharp and deep. Emily was gone. Not just missing, not just out of reach, gone in a way that defied comprehension. She had been erased, along with the Nexus and everything connected to it. And yet, the world around him was intact, restored to balance. Corbin's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He answered it without thinking. "Detective Corbin," he said, his voice rough. "Corbin, where the hell are you?" It was Daniels, the young officer from the precinct. "We've got a situation over at the antique shop on 3rd. The owner's been murdered, throat slit, no signs of forced entry. It's bad." Corbin froze, his breath catching in his throat. "What did you say?" "The antique shop," Daniels repeated. "You need to get down here. Now." Corbin ended the call and leaned against a lamppost, his mind racing. The antique shop. The victim. The case that had started it all. It was happening again. Or maybe it had never stopped. He climbed into his car, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The streets blurred around him as he drove, his mind replaying the events of the last few days, or had it been hours? He couldn't be sure anymore. Time felt slippery, unreliable, as if the web itself were still unraveling. When he arrived at the antique shop, the scene was eerily familiar. The yellow tape, the uniformed officers, the faint smell of copper in the air, it was all the same. Corbin stepped inside, his heart pounding. The body was there, slumped in the same chair. The clocks ticked softly, their hands moving in perfect synchrony. And on the floor, near the victim's hand, was the same ornate gear he had found before. Corbin crouched down, staring at the gear. It was identical in every way, down to the swirling patterns etched into its surface. He picked it up, his fingers trembling. And then he heard it, a faint ticking sound, different from the others. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the room. In the corner, partially hidden behind a stack of old books, was a clock he had never seen before. Its hands were spinning backward, and its face seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Corbin's breath caught. The web wasn't fixed. It had only just begun. Corbin's pulse quickened as he stood, the ornate gear clenched tightly in his hand. The backward spinning clock in the corner seemed to pulse faintly, as though aware of his presence. Its ticking filled the room, distinct and deliberate, drowning out the softer rhythm of the other clocks. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to leave, but he couldn't. Not now. Not after everything. He approached the clock cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the old wooden floor. Its face shimmered faintly, the symbols around its edge glowing with the same golden light he'd seen in the Nexus. This clock was different, it felt alive, almost sentient. Corbin reached out, his fingers hovering over its surface. The air around it felt warm, charged with an energy he couldn't explain. "Detective," a voice called from behind him, making him startle. He turned sharply, his hand immediately going to his gun. Officer Daniels stood in the doorway, wide-eyed and hesitant, his face pale. "You all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Corbin lowered his hand, taking a steadying breath. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice betrayed him. "What's the situation here? Anything new?" Daniels shook his head, stepping further into the room. "Same as before. No witnesses, no forced entry. It's like whoever did this just appeared and disappeared. Forensics is on their way, but," he trailed off, his gaze falling to the backward spinning clock. "What is that?" Corbin hesitated, blocking Daniels' view of the clock. "Nothing you need to worry about," he said quickly. "Just an old piece of junk. Go check with the others outside." Daniels frowned but didn't argue. "If you say so, Detective." He lingered for a moment before stepping back out of the shop, leaving Corbin alone with the clock. As soon as the door closed, Corbin turned back to the device, his heart pounding. The gear in his hand seemed to grow heavier, almost as if it were reacting to the clock's presence. Slowly, carefully, he brought the gear closer to the clock's face. The symbols around its edge began to glow brighter, and the ticking grew louder, more insistent. He hesitated. The last time he'd interacted with one of these clocks, it had sent him spiraling into a labyrinth of choices and consequences he barely understood. And yet, he couldn't ignore the pull, the sense that this clock, this moment, was crucial. Taking a deep breath, Corbin fitted the gear into an empty slot on the side of the clock. The moment it clicked into place, the room shuddered, as if the very air had rippled. The clock's hand stopped spinning backward and froze at a single time, 12:01. The hum of energy around the clock intensified, and Corbin stepped back instinctively, his hand going to his holster. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the golden light began to spill from the clock's face, swirling outward like liquid fire. The light coalesced in the center of the room, forming a shape, a figure. Corbin's breath caught as the light solidified, and the figure became clear. It was Emily. "Emily," he whispered, his voice barely audible. She looked at him, her expression calm but tinged with sorrow. "I told you," she said softly. "The web wasn't fixed. It was only reset. And now it's starting to fray again." Corbin took a cautious step toward her. "How are you here? I thought you were gone. I thought," he stopped himself, his throat tightening. "I thought I erased you." Emily shook her head. "You didn't erase me, Corbin. You reset the threads, but some of them are too tangled to simply go away. I'm still part of this, just as you are. And so are the Guardians." At the mention of the Guardians, Corbin's hand tightened around his gun. "I don't care about them," he said firmly. "I care about you. If you're still here, I'm going to get you out of this." Emily smiled faintly, but it was a sad smile. "You don't understand. I'm not here to be saved. I'm here to warn you." "Warn me about what?" Before she could answer, the air in the room shifted again. The golden light around Emily dimmed, and a new presence filled the space. Corbin turned sharply, his gun drawn, as the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to coalesce into a tall, cloaked figure. Its mask was smooth and featureless, but its very presence exuded authority and menace. "Detective Miles Corbin," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant. "You meddle in forces you cannot comprehend. The clock was not meant for your hands." Corbin kept his gun trained on the figure, his jaw tight. "I didn't ask for any of this," he said coldly. "But I'm here now. And I'm not leaving until I get answers." The Guardian stepped closer, its movements slow but deliberate. "Answers will not save you. Nor will they save her." It gestured toward Emily, who stood silently, her gaze downcast. "The web is unraveling because of your interference. Every choice you've made has pulled at the threads, weakening the fabric of time itself." Corbin's mind raced. "If I'm the problem, then why bring me into this? Why not just let me walk away? The Guardian tilted its head slightly, as if considering his question. Because you are both the disruptor and the key. Your choices have set the web on this path, and only your choices can restore it. Corbin lowered his gun slightly, though his grip remained firm. What does that mean? What are you asking me to do? The Guardian gestured toward the clock, its symbols glowing faintly once more. The clock holds the power to reset the threads again, to repair the damage. But doing so will come at a cost. Corbin's stomach turned. Another cost? What now? The Guardian's voice grew softer, almost contemplative. This time, it is not the Nexus or the Guardians that will be erased. It is you. The words hit Corbin like a punch to the gut. What are you saying? Emily stepped forward, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. If you use the clock again, Corbin, you'll reset the web completely. Everything will go back to how it was before any of this began. The clocks, the Guardians, me, we'll all be where we're meant to be. But you'll be removed from the threads entirely. Corbin stared at her, his mind reeling. You mean I'll cease to exist? Emily nodded. In this timeline, yes. But the world will go on. The fractures will be healed. Time will be restored. Corbin turned away, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear, anger, and despair. How could he make that choice? How could he erase himself from existence, knowing he'd never see the results of his sacrifice? And yet, how could he refuse, knowing the alternative was chaos and destruction? He looked back at Emily, at the Guardian, at the clock. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, suffocating and absolute. Taking a deep breath, he stepped toward the clock. If this is the only way, he said quietly, then I'll do it. Emily's eyes brimmed with tears, but she smiled, a small, bittersweet smile. Thank you, Corbin. For everything. The Guardian said nothing, its form still and solemn as Corbin placed his hands on the clock. Its symbols flared to life, the golden light filling the room once more. The ticking grew louder, faster, until it became a roar. And then, with a final turn of the gear, everything dissolved into light. When the light faded, the world was quiet. The antique shop was gone. The clocks were gone. The web was whole again. And Miles Corbin was no more. The world continued without Miles Corbin, as if he had never existed. The threads of time had been repaired, the fractures smoothed over, and the delicate balance of the web restored. The clocks, the Guardians, the Nexus, all had returned to their rightful places within the tapestry of existence. Yet, there was a faint ripple, a subtle disturbance that lingered in the fabric of reality, as though the shadow of Corbin's sacrifice refused to fade entirely. Weeks passed in the city, life resuming its ordinary rhythm. The antique shop on 3rd Street was open again, its windows gleaming as sunlight bounced off meticulously arranged timepieces. The murder that had once been tied to the shop was now an event that had never occurred. Its owner, an older gentleman with a kind smile, lived peacefully, unaware of the fate he had narrowly avoided. Emily Carter, too, had settled into a quiet life. She worked as a librarian, spending her days surrounded by books and the soft whispers of pages turning. To her, the events involving the Nexus felt like a half-remembered dream, hazy and unreal. Yet, there were moments, fleeting, intangible moments, when she felt a strange emptiness, a sense that something or someone was missing. She couldn't explain it, and she didn't try. It was like a melody she couldn't quite place, lingering at the edge of her thoughts. One evening, as she was closing the library, Emily found herself drawn to the old grandfather clock in the corner. She had walked past it countless times without a second thought, but tonight, something about it compelled her to stop. The clock was unremarkable, a simple design, its pendulum swinging with a steady rhythm. Yet, as she stared at it, she felt a strange pull, a faint echo of something she couldn't name. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the clock's face. For a brief moment, she thought she saw something, a flash of golden light, a shadow of a man standing just out of reach. But when she blinked, it was gone. She shook her head, laughing softly at herself. "Get a grip, Emily," she muttered, turning off the lights and locking the door behind her. Far from the city, in a place outside of time and space, the Guardian stood watch over the Nexus. The massive clock at its center ticked steadily, its gears turning with quiet precision. The web of time stretched out around them, its threads gleaming in the golden light. The lead Guardian stepped forward, its featureless mask reflecting the glow of the Nexus. "The disruptor is no more," it said, its voice deep and resonant. "The web is stable." Another Guardian stepped beside it, its movements deliberate. "And yet, the threads tremble. His absence is felt." The lead Guardian tilted its head slightly. "Such is the nature of sacrifice. The web remembers." For a moment, the Nexus was silent, save for the steady hum of the clock. Then, a faint ripple passed through the threads of time, so subtle it was almost imperceptible. The Guardians turned toward it, their masked faces unreadable. "Something stirs," the second Guardian said. "A fragment remains." The lead Guardian raised a hand, its fingers brushing against the threads. "A shadow," it said. "A memory. It will fade in time." But deep within the Nexus, where the light of the clock was brightest, a faint figure flickered. It was indistinct, barely more than a silhouette, but it was there. And though it had no voice, no form, it seemed to watch, to linger, as if waiting for something or someone. Back in the city, Officer Daniels sat at his desk in the precinct, flipping through old case files. He didn't know why he was drawn to them. They were unsolved cases, long since closed or forgotten. Yet, as he read through the reports, he felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as if he were looking for something he couldn't quite name. One file in particular caught his eye. It was thin, containing little more than a few notes and a photograph of an ornate clock. The report was dated months ago, but there was no detective's name on it, no indication of who had worked the case. Daniels frowned, flipping through the pages. Something about it felt off. He set the file aside, rubbing his temples. "I need more sleep," he muttered, pushing his chair back. As he stood, his gaze fell on the bulletin board at the far end of the room. It was covered in photographs and notes, a chaotic collage of cases and leads. And in the corner, nearly obscured by other papers, was a name written in bold, black letters. Corbin. Daniels froze, his heart skipping a beat. The name was unfamiliar, yet it sent a chill down his spine. He crossed the room, pulling the paper free. It was a case file header, but the details had been erased, the paper faded as if it had been left in the sun too long. All that remained was the name. "Who the hell is Corbin?" Daniels whispered to himself. Behind him, the faint ticking of a clock echoed through the room. He turned sharply, his eyes scanning the empty space. But there was nothing there. Nothing, except the lingering feeling that someone was watching. And so, life continued. The threads of time held firm, the web intact. But in the quiet corners of existence, where light and shadow danced, a presence lingered, a fragment of a man who had once defied the Guardians, who had chosen to sacrifice himself for the greater good. Miles Corbin was gone. But the web remembered. The world moved forward, as it always does, threading itself through time in a delicate dance of cause and effect. Miles Corbin's sacrifice had restored balance, mended the fractures in the web, and erased his own existence from the threads of time. Yet, despite the restoration, the echoes of his actions reverberated faintly, like ripples on a still pond. Months later, Emily Carter walked through the city square, the crisp autumn air carrying the scent of fallen leaves and warm coffee. She clutched a book tightly to her chest, her steps purposeful yet unhurried. The bustling sounds of the city surrounded her, laughter, conversation, the distant hum of traffic, but she felt strangely detached, as though she were moving through a dream. Her life had settled into a routine, mornings at the library, afternoons cataloging books, evenings spent with a cup of tea and the quiet company of novels. Yet, there was a restlessness she couldn't shake, a sense that something was missing. It wasn't something she could name, only feel, a hollow space in her heart that no amount of normalcy could fill. As she crossed the square, her gaze fell on a small antique shop tucked between two larger storefronts. Its windows were dusty, the display inside cluttered with old trinkets and faded curiosities. She hesitated, her feet slowing. There was nothing remarkable about the shop, yet it drew her in, as though it were calling to her. The bell above the door jingled softly as she stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and time-worn leather. Shelves lined with clocks of every shape and size surrounded her, their ticking creating a symphony of overlapping rhythms. Emily wandered through the shop, her fingers brushing against the cool surfaces of brass and glass, her mind drifting. Near the back of the shop, she stopped. There, tucked away in a corner, was a clock unlike any of the others. Its face was simple, its design unadorned, yet it seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Emily's breath caught as she reached for it, her fingers trembling slightly. The moment her hand touched the clock, a faint hum filled the air, and a strange warmth spread through her chest. She pulled her hand back, startled. The shopkeeper, an older man with kind eyes, appeared beside her, wiping his hands on a cloth. "That one's been here a long time," he said, his voice soft. "No one's ever taken much notice of it." Emily turned to him, her brow furrowing. "Where did it come from?" The man shrugged. "Couldn't tell you. It's been here longer than I have. Some things just end up where they're meant to be." Emily nodded absently, her gaze returning to the clock. She felt an inexplicable connection to it, as though it held a secret only she could understand. "I'll take it," she said quietly. The shopkeeper smiled. "Good choice." That night, Emily sat in her small apartment, the clock resting on the table in front of her. She had cleaned it carefully, polishing the glass face until it gleamed. Yet, as she stared at it, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a clock. There was something about it, something familiar and elusive, like a word on the tip of her tongue. She turned the key on its side, winding it slowly. The clock began to tick, its hands moving with a steady rhythm. And then, as the ticking grew louder, the air in the room seemed to shift. The shadows deepened, and a faint golden light emanated from the clock's face. Emily leaned back, her heart pounding. The light grew brighter, swirling like liquid fire, forming shapes and patterns that danced across the walls. And then, in the center of the light, a figure began to take shape, a man, his features indistinct but familiar. "Emily," the figure said, his voice low and resonant. She gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Who are you?" The figure stepped closer, the golden light shimmering around him. "You don't remember me," he said softly. "But I remember you." Emily's heart ached with a strange, unexplainable sadness. "I feel like I know you," she whispered. "But I don't understand. Who are you?" The figure hesitated, his form flickering like a flame in the wind. "My name was Miles Corbin," he said. "I was a detective. And I gave it all up to save you. To save everything." Emily's mind reeled. The name meant nothing to her, yet it resonated deep within her, stirring memories she couldn't quite grasp. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Corbin admitted. "I shouldn't be. I should be gone, erased. But some part of me, some part of us, refused to let go. The web remembers, Emily. And so do you." Tears filled her eyes as she reached out, her hand passing through the golden light. "What do I do? How do I help you?" Corbin's form began to fade, the light flickering. "You already have," he said. "You're the keeper, Emily. You anchor the threads. Without you, none of this would have been possible." "No," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't go. Please, don't go." Corbin smiled faintly, his expression filled with both sorrow and peace. "I'm sorry. I can't stay. But you'll be all right. You've always been stronger than you know." The light flared once more, blinding her. When it faded, the room was silent, the clock ticking softly on the table. Emily sat alone, tears streaming down her face, her heart heavy with loss she couldn't fully comprehend. Years later, Emily never spoke of the man in the golden light, nor of the clock that now sat on her mantel, ticking softly through the years. But she carried his memory with her, even if she didn't fully understand it. In quiet moments, she would catch herself staring at the clock, her mind drifting to a man she had never truly known but somehow loved. And somewhere, in a place outside of time, Miles Corbin watched over her, his presence a faint echo in the threads of the web. Though he was gone, his sacrifice had not been in vain. The world was whole, the web intact, and the clocks ticked on, their rhythm steady and unyielding. Time moved forward, as it always does. But in the quiet spaces between moments, the web remembered. And so did she.